Well, it's really cool to hear a few different people familiar with ShapeUp and in a similar position to what got me interested in making this a topic for the meetup, because my company as well is starting to use ShapeUp and transitioning away from more traditional Agile Scrum workflow. And it's something I think just like as a company, we were struggling with like identifying what we really wanted to do or what our process was. And we're pretty small teams, like growing from, since I started as the third engineer to now having like 6 and QA people and bigger marketing team. We wanted to formalize a better pattern, and ShapeUp seemed to fit really well. So I think I'm going to learn a lot of great things from this. So I'm definitely not the most experienced out of the group. So what I'd like to do maybe is, I guess, give like a quick play-by-play of how we might categorize what Agile is and extreme programming, and then get into some ShapeUp stuff. So if anyone has like a good perspective on the history and would like to share how we've arrived at the state of software development we're at today, that'd be pretty fun. Start with that.
Oh man, everybody's speaking up at once, Adam.
All right.
I think you're supposed to seed the crowd, right?
Okay. Well, how about I'll just start saying things that are incorrect, and then people will be motivated to correct me. So back in the land before time, the time of the IBM mainframes and our good friend Fred Brooks, we thought of software to be something that's developed like products on an assembly line, and things that were computing was so expensive to do, you had to sit in a room with a pad of paper and a pencil for many hours or days, and you come up with what you're doing and you put it in the computer, and then your first try it works because it's too expensive to fail. So that's how software started. And I guess web changed a lot of things, and the way websites became web applications, and Java also having a big influence in enterprise development. So people got together and decided that they needed a way to describe why everyone was unhappy at work, and came up with extreme programming in the 90s, and a list of rules to like companies should follow to not let their software projects go on indefinitely and all their programmers leave because it was too frustrating to deliver on time. And is anyone else familiar with extreme programming or wishes we still did that? All right.
Me.
Miles?
So my first exposure to really agile methodologies in general was via Extreme Programming Explained, which I think is still sitting on the bookshelf back here. Nope, I loaned it to somebody. Anyway, and what I liked about it is that it's, and I'm also stealing from someone else's words for the record, that I read recently in a tweet thread, which tweet threads are the worst, by the way, but that's another topic for another day. Scrum as an agile methodology, I feel like tends to be very rule based, right? Like, here are the rules, here's the process as to how to get this thing done. And I think partially probably because it was introduced to me early in my career, when Davey and I were the only 2 engineers at N-Frame back in the day, and partially because extreme programming tends to be like, here are principles or things to value. Here are practices that we believe follow those principles, but it's not necessarily a hard and fast rule. But I did just learn today, I did not realize that like Scrum, extreme programming, and a bunch of these other things that I hadn't heard of, dynamic systems development method, unified process, are all from the 90s, which actually makes me feel young. So this is good news today. It's been a good meeting already. We can quit now.
Yeah, that exactly. It's kind of weird how all of this seems very new, but people have been running businesses since the beginning of humanity, I guess, or prior. So some of my pessimism or skepticism is that we're just still kind of geeks thinking we're figuring it out for the first time instead of sitting down and like learning from our coworkers that aren't programmers. But for those unfamiliar with extreme programming, like a summary could be like what we think of as doing agile. And it's like, define user stories, split up your work into tasks, do the concrete tasks, do it as simple as possible so you can do work as quickly and like kind of iterate as you go. And that was the methodology there with extreme programming. And agile was like almost in a less, like extreme programming is you can go to like extremeprogramming.org or .com and see the rules, and they're very like concrete things you can actually do. And the Agile Manifesto, which I think was like signed and published in the early 2000s, like maybe 2002 or so, were a bunch of extreme programming people that wanted to like declare what it means like from the business perspective. So it started to prioritize like know your customer and what the business needs are, and don't waste your time with things that are like over-engineered if they don't like correlate directly with the business needs. And that is sort of the angle I think we see teams today like doing, and what I've like immediately started struggling with leaving school and getting into software development professionally, where it's like, okay, where is my time most valuable, and how do I determine what I'm doing is what we need, and not like succumbing to technical debt either. I don't know if I'm doing a good job so far facilitating or whatever, but
I put in the chat a Twitter hot take related to Agile.
Tony likes his hot takes.
Well, I mean,
no, it's a good one.
Yes, I do.
Well, so yeah, what are some of the things that you think Agile like fails to do?
Agile,
or where you've seen it fail?
Agile requires a 100% buy-in from all parties to actually do, like, if you want the fake stamp of we are Agile and we actually are not BSing, you need 100% buy-in on all parties from that. I have yet to see a place that has did that. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but I've yet to see a place that has done that totally.
Tony, what's an example of an agile practice that you see regularly does not receive 100% buy-in?
Well, scrums are really just stand-up, glorified stand-up, is what they have become. I wish I got into the ground floor of planning poker, because there are companies that made a lot of money selling cards. I've seen it.
Where I've seen it fail personally, and why we ended up switching to something influenced by what became Shape Up, was that it's not really a programmer failure so much as a business failure in a lot of cases. The business doesn't get a lot of visibility into when things will get done, what things will actually get done. And it's difficult to plan things like marketing releases around when a particular feature might go live, or even in the face of shifting priorities, like how to like put things on it. We were doing full-on Kanban, which is a flavor of this, where it's just like you move a story, you move it to the right as fast as you can, then you start something else. And one of the problems we ran into was the business had no idea what was going on, when stuff was going live. Everything just went into this undifferentiated bucket, and then came out the other side. And that's why we ended up adjusting it slightly later on.
I mean, that is in some ways. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I like the concept of sprints, where you have we'll just arbitrarily say 2 weeks, because that seems to be the default for a lot of people. Of 2 weeks, this is overall our focus. Hopefully, we have built some padding in so we can adjust as needed. And this is what we aim to at least have done. Done does not mean delivered. Done does not mean deployed, because then that allows for marketing to at least have somewhat of an idea of, okay, these are all done. We're ready to say go. Type of deal.
I think we have 18 people on this call, and I have just now realized that we're about to have 18 different takes on project management. So
You can mute me, Miles, because I can talk all night about this.
Brandon, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think one of the things that is hard that I've seen that I think is a constant, I won't say failure, but a really hard thing for, let's say, when I say management, people say above, manager level, is to kind of relinquish the need to really micromanage the teams. Like there's this uncertainty scares them. And when you build out teams that are self-organizing and kind of want to manage themselves, they still want to have that deep, low-level insight into what's going on. Like, what's a team's velocity? Like, how much output are people? They focus so much on treating things like backlogs and sprints as kind of work management tools, and less focus on just watching the outcomes of the teams. And the idea that it's like, hey, these numbers that we put down, don't judge us by those numbers when we sum them up. It's very counterintuitive. And I think the biggest failure is kind of that, is that it's not so much that, say, I'm a Scrum Master, so I'm kind of focused on one, but I would say not so much that there's faults in Agile or that sort of thing, but that it just gets so improperly used. And I think sometimes that can be the result of not really investing in learning how to do this stuff. You need people who are knowledgeable about the process, and have people like Scrum Masters to kind of help coach and guide the business and kind of serve as that intermediary to protect teams. And I think a lot of businesses don't really invest in that. They say, we've got Scrum, we have stand-ups, we have reviews, and this is a process, and we go with it. And they don't embrace the agility and chaos. And that's hard for them to do. And I get it, but like every place I go, that always seems to be the case. So
I think that kind of rings true for me, and like kind of what led me to Shape Up was that, like, if you look at the original Agile Manifesto and like sort of the ideas behind it, a lot of it is about, communication and showing progress through work. And it seems like the breakdown, over time, companies kind of really got married to these processes and ceremonies. And, so now you're losing that original spirit. You're losing the communication and the showing progress through work, and you're relying on like Jira, to sort of like have the illusion of communication.
Yeah. They want velocities and charts, and that's how we measure productivity. And that's really, that's not what it is. So I will admit, when I first looked at Basecamp, I think we talked about this in my interview at Leslie. I twitched a little bit because it seemed very waterfally to me to start off with, which felt like a step back. But I kind of learned to embrace it, and I've actually been thinking about advocating it for my team as well. So I'm really interested to hear your take on it and kind of what you're doing with it, even though I should probably just slack you about this at work.
Yeah.
I think it's just, to Ross, to your point, I mean, looking at all of the meetings and stuff that used to be, I mean, when you do a 2-week iteration, I mean, you're having so many hours worth of planning and vetting and retro and all these other things. And half the time you schedule 40 points or something like that, and then you end up getting 40 points done, but it was a different 40 points than you guys had committed to. Like, there's just all of these processes, that are there to try to help everyone do better. And again, for the management aspect of it, but like, I really do think that Shape Up helps put the focus back on the engineering teams and really let them kind of hit the ground running.
Yeah, like story. I think one of the real striking things for me is like one of the early Agile Manifesto people. I can't remember which one it was, but they were tweeting about story points and basically talking about how like they were literally the only use for them was to know if you should break your work up into a smaller chunk. It's not there to represent anything else. But then like fast forward to now and like velocity charts and all the things people try to shoehorn them into.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so fun to hear all of this stuff because it like parallels exactly what a lot of the Shape Up book talks about in our own companies or my own company's like experience and struggle. And it's weird how I think we have pretty strong intuitions about these things, but then don't know what to do with them when it doesn't fit the model. And that's what how I've thought about it a little bit, like, oh, okay, well, we have this enormous backlog, but it doesn't seem like it's such a problem because we always prioritize it before the sprint. But then later someone comes along and it's like, well, why didn't you do that? And it's like, well, I don't know. Why didn't you say it was higher priority or whatever? So that, I think, was when our management team or CTO just sort of declared bankruptcy on our Agile workflow. And it's like, okay, let's try Shape Up, and here's a Basecamp account. And when the first time logging in, I was like, what is this garbage? Like, Basecamp is like, doesn't make any sense. Is it Google Drive? Like, what is going on? So I had no idea of like what to do with the stuff, and then I read the Shape Up book, and it's like, oh man, this is exactly what I want to do to like work on software. So maybe to give a quick like summary of what Shape Up is, and like the pure way of doing it is like, you're not going to have sprints and you're not going to have estimates. Everyone gets to manage their tasks however they like to, and that goes for planning new projects and working on your current ones. So right away, you just sort of get a lot of control back. And instead of doing your retrospectives or your sprint planning and the grooming, you have shaping up, which is, let's think of what I want to do, and then the betting table, where you come together as, I guess, an engineering team or just with your stakeholders and decide, this is really important for us to do. Like, we don't have any unit tests in this product. We need to like spend some time on that, and this is how long it's going to take. And people get a chance to say, well, I can let you do that for 1 week, but not for 3 weeks. And the recommended length of a Shape Up cycle is 6 weeks, which already is like, okay, that makes a little more sense to have more than 2 weeks at a time to focus on something. And the idea is, if you don't get something done that you committed to in the 6 weeks, it's gone. And you're not going to keep working on it the way a 2 week sprint lends itself to like extending by days or a whole other sprint. So I don't know if anyone else has something to add to that. But if you haven't come across Shape Up before, the online book Basecamp has is very easy to skim through, and it's very good to read all the way through. I'm pretty impressed with how they've organized that. And maybe we can screen share some information once we get further along, but yeah. I don't know. So who else besides Ross, I know, is doing Shape Up now?
It's like I kind of alluded to earlier, before there was a book and a name for it. There was just a blog post that talked about the way they worked, which we ended up adopting at Sigster and switching from Kanban to, we did it as a 6 week cycle, and essentially like there'd be a product release at the end of that so that we'd know what would be in it. And then we'd have a 2 week shoulder. that was intended to be more planning for what the next 6 weeks was going to be, and also just cleanup and maintenance, like all the stuff we didn't necessarily get to in the previous 6 weeks. So we had a little bit of buffer if we did overshoot a little bit. We didn't do betting table. We didn't do any of that, but just setting stuff into 6-week cycles gave us enough room to actually deliver something. Like inside of 2 weeks, delivering a meaningful product, like a full-fledged product feature, is really hard. And then you end up having very small and not all that significant features, or you end up breaking things out across like 6 cycles or something like that. With 6 weeks, you can get something pretty substantial out the door, something that you can put on a press release, something your salespeople can talk about. And in 2 cycles, if you happen to have to do them back to back and you split them up into something logical, you could do a lot, which we used a lot. I was actually a little surprised. It's like, oh, they gave that a name. So I downloaded the book and actually need to read it, because I jumped on the blog post when it first went up. It's like, this has to be better than the way we're working now. And it was. It gave the business a lot more visibility and a lot more certitude. Like they would know when stuff was coming. And we could negotiate on scope after that around like, no, really, this isn't going to fit inside of 6 weeks. If you want to do a press release at the end of this, we have to cut this, and the other. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, when we did it at Xylo, I felt that in some ways was the most valuable thing we got out of Basecamp, was really forcing product scope to think about the most valuable features. You know, that saying that's what, 20% of your features have 80% of the value.
Yeah.
It really made them think about that, because they knew once we started, you know, in Scrum, you have the whole process of negotiation and that sort of thing, and that can lead to things drawn out. Whereas with Basecamp, they're much more rigid on that commitment. And I felt like that was probably the most valuable thing I got, because there was not a lot of time spent around debating, you know, the whole bike shed argument, like that kind of goes away. Like, yeah, we're not going to argue about font colors when, you know, we have to make this thing functional. So I did really like that about the process.
Yeah, after we did it for a couple of cycles, like the first time we did it was just a hard transition from one to the other. And it was like, oh crap, like this isn't going to fit. And so you end up having that scope conversation at 6 weeks, right? Or like 5 weeks. It's
right,
like, yeah. And so all we did was just keep moving that conversation earlier and earlier and earlier, and just try to cut down to the bone whatever it is you're trying to do. And really, like in your head, you're thinking like, this will take 3 weeks. But it won't. It'll take 6. And just get better at that over time. And it is a muscle you kind of have to train, at least our flavor of it. Like, I haven't read the book yet, so there's probably lots of details and other ways of working it that can improve what we were doing. But yeah, got better at it over time.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things was nice. Our product manager keeps always pounding onto us, you know, the whole point of doing the shape-up model is fixed time variable scope. It's like, as opposed to going into an iteration saying, okay, what can we fit in, you know, how many things can we fit into 2 weeks? The mentality is now, okay, well, we only have 6 weeks. Like that doesn't change. Can't change time. So what all can we kind of accomplish in this window? And that, I think, was a huge game changer for us in terms of just framing how we approach some of these issues.
Yeah, just adding that constraint. One of the problems we had in Kanban was like we had no constraints. Like it was like time wasn't a constraint. Stuff went out whenever it went out. Scope wasn't a constraint. They just add new tickets in over time. So you're working in this environment with no constraints at all. So you never had a productive conversation around what are we actually building? What's the scope of this thing? Just applying that time constraint of like, it has to fit in 6 weeks because then we're moving on. Really helps drive those discussions a lot better.
Can I ask you a question?
Me?
Well, yes.
Sure.
Or anyone who has done that 6 week thing. What if the business is like, no, we really, the thing that you said you can get done in 6 weeks is not quite enough. What if you added this and that, and you're like, well, then it would take 8 weeks. What happens?
The way we tried to approach it, and again, I haven't read the book, and I'm sorry if I'm hijacking the whole conversation. I didn't mean to. The way we generally did it was...
I made it that way.
We tried to make sure the thing at the end of 6 weeks was releasable. Like, you could put it on a press release. You could tell your customers about it. Now, it might be part of a larger thing that's going to take 2 of these cycles. Like, for instance, we did a complete rebuild and redesign of like our campaign index pages and campaign detail pages and like all that sort of stuff. And we wanted to, what I called repot them at the same time, like move them out of the old app and into the new thing. And so that took for friggin' ever. So the first cycle was we have a new campaign API, right? We didn't do any of the front end. It's just like, we have an API for this thing now. And then the next cycle was like, and now we have a front end. So breaking things into logical, shippable stuff that are 6-week cycles when it gets longer than that. When it's just 2 weeks though, that either needs to, when we were doing it, it either needed to fit in the shoulder. Like, that's one of the reasons we baked in that 2 weeks at the end, was like, just in case scope did move a little bit, or just, support stuff we hadn't been paying attention to or something like that. Either that, or just, it goes into the next one. It becomes part of the deliverables for the next thing. At least how we did it.
Yeah, and sometimes it doesn't, right? Like, we had we broke up some of our endeavors into 2-ish week cycles or 3-week cycles, half sprints, whatever have you. It doesn't have to be 6 weeks. But we had someone on PTO that we didn't account for, and as a result, we kind of missed the overarching, a lot of what we were hoping to get out of this feature. And it was a really good chance for us to say, well, like, if you miss it or if it gets pushed out, it goes back to the betting table against everything else that's potentially going to be pulled in the next time around. And it was really telling because that didn't get pulled back in. Like, we could have hauled rear and worked, through our cooldown trying to get something done, but that was decided. It's like, well, we missed it. Like, but these other things are more important. Like, that was a really cool really cool thing to see out of this system.
Yeah, I don't remember a single time any scope we cut out ever getting worked on ever again. Like, it was just like we cut it out really early and then it never popped back up.
I did feel like too, I did feel like too, having the whole betting table and having everybody kind of put their ideas out there too forced people to really think about the value of the thing they're proposing, because people wanted their stuff to get worked on. So I personally felt like in the brief time we did it, we were much less likely to get these additional add-on requests or that sort of thing, or like, oh, I forgot this thing, because there was a little bit more work and effort going in up front to make sure that, hey, I'm going to pitch my idea. I want this to be sound and really thought out. And it's not just, writing a story and throwing it on backlog and prioritizing. So, I'm selling myself on it more and more every day.
And having that,
if I'm going to chime in, if it's okay.
Yeah, go for it.
So this is interesting to hear this perspective, because I've been doing 2-week increments of 2-week sprints, and what I'm hearing from the group here is very similar things that happens in a 2-week sprint versus a 6-week sprint. So like, there's still that control of like, hey, you have a limited amount of time and that's not moving on yet. So if you're going to change something, it's going to be something in scope. That's going to happen whether it's 2 weeks or 6 weeks. And then in terms of like buy-in from the business, it seems like the 6-week is actually encouraging that buy-in from the business, because they realize like once they let this go, we don't have devs for 6 weeks and they're going to be working on this. So we better be pretty damn serious about this, or we're making the wrong call. And it's going to take us 6 weeks to make that say, stop, don't do any more of this. And I feel like the 2-week, a lot of people started with that because of the fact that like we can decide earlier that this was a bad idea and we shouldn't go any further spending more money on this. But I also think that one of the downfalls of the 2-week sprint is, and this could be a downfall, I think, of the 6-week sprint too, but I think that the downfall of it is not having the devs tied into the business goals soon enough. So what I've seen this happen over and over again, it's like the stuff that gets thought through by design and by the program manager or the product manager, they've got some ideas about how it's going to happen, what they need to get done. And then it's like it gets put on the backlog, and then it gets presented to the devs. And then there's like a 30-minute kickoff. And that's basically the input time that they get to say something about it. And I think that's where things fall apart. I don't think it's really about the 2 weeks or the 6 weeks. I think it's about getting all the people in the room at the right time, talking about the same things. And this goes back to the manifesto of it's the things we put in terms of process, like the 6 weeks or the 2 weeks or documentation, all that stuff. Like all that stuff is there for, in my opinion, is just to force or to have a reference point to all the conversations that need to happen. So they're either things that start the conversations, or they're things that help us not regurgitate a conversation that's already been had 3 or 4 other times because we've already documented it in a subtle way, not like in deep depth, but enough that we can say, wait a minute, we're going down that bad road again. Let's stop on that one. And we can have the conversation and be truthful about what is the right thing to do. But I think that's more the root cause than this whole timing thing. And I think that what happens sometimes in this, when the product managers don't have a clear, or the business doesn't have a clear idea of what they want to do next, that what happens is you have developers that are smart and want to do their creation and want to do their thing. And if you don't give them part of the business stuff to do, what they fall back on doing is, hey, I'm good at tech. I'm going to make my good thing in tech. I'm going to design something really well in tech, and I'm going to do that. So you end up filling your time with that and not really connecting it to the business as well as it should be. And I think that's where business fails to encourage, incorporate, collaborate with development. And I'll step down from my plateau here and let you guys think and talk about that one.
The one thing that I have is, so like PackSafe's been transitioning into the shape up methodology, and these past cycle or two, what we've been really focused is not so much how do the developers do shape up, it's also how do we come up with the right pitches. And part of shape up, I would actually say more of the shape up book is about getting to the point of the betting table and going through that process of when is the right time to bring in your developers. And that's something that shape up takes into account, because what you're really supposed to do is it's supposed to be, you have your development track, which is what, I would say the majority of us do on a day-to-day. Then you also have your product-based track. And during that time, product is supposed to then start creating pitches, which then get eventually betted on. But throughout that process of creating the pitches, that's where they come in and they snag maybe a dev or two for 20 minutes or 30 minutes to talk through hey, what are the things I'm not thinking about here? And I think PackSafe's biggest downfall to adopting ShapeUp to start with was we were using the 2-week cooldown period to do all of the talk to the devs for the first time. And that felt more to me like what happens when we did sprint planning, because oftentimes the developers would be seeing some of these stories for the very first time. Whereas with ShapeUp, it's actually supposed to be designed where you're picking in developers such that when everybody comes to the betting table, the majority of the people that are going to be building it this isn't their first time seeing it. So just something that we're working through as an organization. What does that actually look like in practice? But just thought I'd throw that out there.
I cannot count how many times sprint planning came up. The team I was on was very product facing at the time. And you're seeing stories for the first time. The first thing I say after we glance at a story, I say why. I look straight at the product holder and I say, why are we doing this? Because that is the only chance that the developers have to, one, any feedback, and two, it's okay, let's hear your sales pitch on this because we're hearing this for the first time. Maybe if it's a really bad idea, we can stop it now, and this is our only chance to do it. They really, really hated when I did that, but it forced them to actually think about stuff. 99% of the time, we did it anyway, regardless, but at least gave me a mental victory of at least making them tried to justify the stuff that they wanted to do.
Well, it's not just that, but as an engineer, if you know the context behind what they're betting on and what they're presenting, you can suggest alternative ideas, which is one of the reasons I did the same thing. Like, in fact, I told people up front, like, if you don't tell me why, I'm going to assume the worst possible thing, and B, I'm going to ask you. And I'll keep asking until I get an answer that I like. And so, but having that context, it wasn't necessarily to like force them to answer it necessarily. But instead it was around, when we're going to review what it is you're wanting us to do, I can suggest alternate approaches that might require less scope, might be able to get done faster, might accomplish the same thing, but be easier technically. And if I don't have that context of what business problem we're trying to solve, it's much more difficult for me to be able to suggest something that might make sense.
Sounds like a lot of people have brought up engineers being brought in very late in the sort of product development process. Engineers being brought in just to do the coding, maybe more than engineers being brought in as expert level consultants on the technical feasibility and implementation at a high level of some given product. Sorry, Lucas is sending me side messages, but to be fair, I was sending him side messages first. His are much funnier than mine. And I'm so that is one thing. It sounds like it has driven a lot of people kind of towards shape up. The constraint of 2-week sprints is something that I've heard pretty commonly. And part of the reason I'm calling these out is I might be the only person who is both not doing shape up and is happy with our particular flavor of Agile that we're doing right now. So I'm trying to find where these friction points are that have led people to start to look at shape up as a specific alternative, just to kind of help me self-analyze a little bit what we do, and if we have these problems, and how to know whether shape up would be right for us, or even look just adopting a couple of the practices. Because I'm a big believer that choosing any one agile methodology, big A agile methodology, if you will, and adopting it wholesale is probably not the right thing unless you already know that your team perfectly fits that mold. I'd love to hear from maybe some of the less experienced folks in the room with any question. If you're brave enough, and you certainly don't have to speak up, any questions you might have about anything that has been said today that you're like, oh, that's clearly a dumb question, so I'm not going to ask it. So think of what that is. I'm going to ask a dumb question because everyone has talked about this as if it is clear what that thing is. But can someone, in simple terms, explain what the hell the betting table is? Because I Googled it and a whole lot of stuff about Las Vegas things came up and I was very confused.
Well, it involves going to Vegas.
I think in kind of a nutshell, like you have sort of the shaping part of the process first. And during that, you're not trying to spell out exactly what you're going to build. You're trying to spell out the business need for it and general guide rails around what's acceptable for a solution, and kind of selling the idea. And so then it goes to that point they call the betting table, which is when you decide what you're going to work on next. And at Basecamp, there's a set group of people that actually make that decision, the kind of the higher level. At Lessonly, it's been a little bit different because on our squads, we've been given a little more autonomy to kind of decide our own priorities. So for us, the betting table is on the squad level, we decide, what is the next priority given what we know about their business need. So that's kind of.
How big's your squad? What's your squad makeup look like?
Currently, we have my squad has two engineers, a designer, and then not really a project manager, but somebody from sales that we ask about business related things.
Nice. Some sort of product owner, I think, is something some agile methodologies might call that person, right?
Yeah.
We had a project owner, but we She ended up moving to another team. So now the project owner responsibilities are just the engineers do that stuff basically.
Yeah, the nice thing about the betting table too is it lets you bring in like people that may not have been as involved in what was being picked before. So like before, our salesperson wasn't really involved until after everything was decided on what's coming down the pipe. And so they weren't able to give input of like, hey, well, I've been trying to sell this deal for 4 months and we need this feature. Why isn't this getting shipped? So they've got that, as well as our CEO, who's somebody who's in the realm, but he's not necessarily picking what's happening next. And so by instead having this big betting table where you're bringing in more of the key players, they get to have a say and a choice of, ultimately it's a group decision and a group vote. But I think it's a good opportunity to bring in people that may not, and say a sprint planning meeting because they're too busy doing something else.
I have a question for Miles, actually, since he's someone who is actually satisfied with his current implementation of Agile. Thinking about some of the things that Chris and Tony brought up as often failing to get buy-in from the big bosses, how do you keep your big bosses happy with the relative uncertainty that comes from planning in 2-week cycles when they want to know exactly, or do you just have bosses that don't care to know what's happening 6 months from now and 18 months from now and everything else?
We are generally, so this is probably partially a function of being an early stage startup and partially a function of them being a little bit less worried about that. Now, I will say that I have experienced less worry about that previously up until the point of large VC investments, at which point suddenly everybody is worried about what's happening in 12 to 18 months. So I do think it's very possible that this all changes for me at some point. But right now, I would say they tend to think 3 to 6 months out from a product perspective, what they need, which is nice. And so we don't do formal 2-week sprints. We use Pivotal Tracker, and it is set to 2-week sprints, right? But we probably do something that's a little bit more, and I have not done a formal version of any of these things, but I think it's a little bit more Kanban style, where things are prioritized as they're prioritized regardless. And so we don't we don't have a meeting beforehand to say, this is exactly what we can fit in this sprint. We do grooming. And so then, as you know, Davey, Pivotal Tracker kind of just, if you prioritize things the way you want them, Pivotal Tracker just tells you more or less when things are going to get done, or when it thinks things will get done based on your last 5-week average velocity. And so really for us, the grooming, the points, as someone said, originally intended just to know if you need to break up a story more. It does that, but it also allows me to pretty roughly forecast for leadership. Hey, all the stories are now in Pivotal Tracker, and we've prioritized them against other stories, and we've groomed them, and I can tell you that this thing is estimated to get done at the end of October, So if you change things around, like that's going to change. But right now, if we keep things the way they are, like that's where we're at. And so I'm so far able to give just enough clarity to them that they're happy. And then, sometimes we can do like all right, folks, like this is super important. Here's why it's important. I would appreciate a little bit extra focus. And I don't mean extra work time, just mean, let's try to be efficient here. Let me know as soon as you have a roadblock and I'll get it out of the way, sort of thing. If they think they need it 1 week earlier or something like that. But for the most part, they hear us when we say this is going to be the end of October. They might ask, can it be faster? And I might say, yeah, if you push everything away, or no, because you can't add people or whatever in order to make a baby come in fewer than 9 months. It's not going to happen. So it's certainly at least somewhat a function of lower pressure. And that was actually a question I was curious about for the rest of you who are seeking alternatives. Do you feel like did heavy pressure from above, if you will, death from above, Is that what has led to you looking at ShapeUp, or was it an internal, an introspective, I guess, mechanism that led to this?
I'll say like one thing for us, or at least me specifically, because I've been working on a project that's a little bit segmented from where Michael works, but it was, we weren't shipping on time. Basically, like 2 weeks was way too little time to get something shipped. Basically, what we were doing is rebuilding our front end from scratch. So you're trying to build something that was 4 or 5 years to build in a year and a half. But the biggest problem with that was and I guess I'll turn this around as a question to the people that do 2 week sprints still, is how would you handle the unknowns that you simply cannot know until you start the work? And that was something that, like, when we did sprint planning, you are committing for a 2 week period of time exactly what your work's going to be. Whereas with ShapeUp, you have a 6 week chunk of time, and you as the engineer get to own what the tickets are that are created. And the way that ShapeUp says is, like, the fact of the matter is most of the time you're only going to know 50% or half of what you need to know upfront when saying what exact work needs to be done. And so where that equates to in Agile, to me, is just bad estimates of stories. You say this is going to take 10 points, and their answer to that is say, just blow up the estimate. Well, that doesn't help. And so I found, there's a chart that I had too, and we plotted our burn down over the course of a cycle, and it shows, like, they call it a hill chart, and they say about halfway through your 6 weeks, that's when all of your unknowns should now be known. And you should know roughly, like, are we on top of the hills? Are we just coasted? We're wrapping stuff up, or are we still figuring stuff out? And it's been interesting. Like, it's just been a lot less pressure, I guess, to answer your question, Miles, from that perspective on my end. Whereas before, you commit to something up front, and then like a week or 2 in, you're like, what the heck did I just commit to? Like, there's so much other stuff that needs to be done here, or we didn't account for this really important thing.
I would definitely echo that. Like, I was on a project where communication was kind of poor and it was running long. And one of the big things that we took away from ShapeUp that helped was that concept of, hey, look, when you start on a segment of your project, besides the fixed time variable scope, I'd say that was probably the biggest, because it forced those conversations. But then having that concept of, hey, look, you're going to start the project, and those are just imagined tasks. That's just what you imagine you're going to have to do. And then as you start into that project, you're going to have tasks you discover. Whereas before, we always were like, oh, scope creep, new things pop up. And it was almost like a bad thing that it's like, oh, it's changing, we missed something. Whereas like with ShapeUp, it's like, no, look, that is going to happen. And here's a framework where you're going to talk about it then as a team. And so that's what made the difference for us as a team, is then when these things happened, we would sit down as a full squad, like designer, everybody involved, and we'd talk about like, okay, here's where we stand. What is a must-have by the end of this 6 week period? And what is something we're going to need to just say is a nice to have, because we can't get it all done.
Yeah,
I think comment on real quick the whole thing about dealing with unknowns in a 2 week sprint. Oddly enough, one of the places where I feel like we did the traditional Scrum Agile processes the best was Salesforce when I was there, which is weird because it's this giant company with a lot of bureaucracy and a monolith of an application. But part of it was that if we saw a story, but when we were coming up to a sprint that we hadn't seen and we hadn't talked about, we weren't going to commit to that work ever. It should have been groomed and had a very clear definition of ready met before we started that work, meaning that it had clear acceptance criteria, was broken down appropriately, and we had identified any major technical hurdles or unknowns that might have gone on with that. I think if you're doing good grooming in advance, then you can kind of get around that. Not to say it won't ever happen, but it requires, I think, being diligent about making sure that everything was groomed in advance. Whereas, with Basecamp, you're kind of you should be still kind of sussing out those technical hurdles so that there's no major surprises. But if you do that, then the unknowns hopefully are minimized to like a containable risk in that time frame. So that's my Scrum Master hat that I put on, and I'm now taking off and done.
Wouldn't that be hard though when you like, I feel like some unknowns like you can't just figure out by grooming. Like you have to just do the work or like get the majority of the work done to know what's ahead. Maybe you can. I don't know.
That's
I'm
why
kind of new to my professional world, so
that's why you have to. It's a necessary evil, in my opinion. 6 or 2 week sprint, some buffer just in case. With Chris, it's the extra 2 weeks that they, for all intents and purposes, jury-rigged in. Miles, I think why you're having a decent amount of success with your setup is a similar reason why a previous employer who was also, we'll just say fake agile, because that's really what this all is, had success is, and I'm going to use this word very carefully here, there was a punching bag between dev and the rest of the business. And when I say punching bag, I mean a very good project manager that will translate to upper, this is where we're at, this is where we're expecting to be, and then can translate down saying, okay, where are we at? What needs to get done? What issues do you have? Is it with another department? You know, we can meet, work, figure that out. What, you know, what needs to get done? Stuff like that.
So an interesting note on that, because I will say that I think the thing that the place we share in common that I think we're both dancing around a little bit here, right? There are some things I learned from there that I think have been able to help my current situation as well. And one of the main ones, honestly, is so I advocated hard there for 2 week sprints, partially because that was in place, and it became like I felt like the team wasn't performing well, and so I was like, all right, let's lean into the sprints aspect. Let's finish our sprints. So if we commit at the beginning of 2 weeks, let's have that completed at the end of 2 weeks. And in hindsight, I feel like I made up dumb reasons why that was a good idea that I no longer believe. But we worked really hard to try to do that, and still only made maybe like 1 sprint out of 3 on a regular basis. And that is part of what has shaped mine. Now I'm like, forget sprints. Like sprints and points are for me to forecast and tell, the CEO, or in some cases even the director of product, to let them know this is approximately when this is going to be done. And then honestly, I mean, this is very much an implementation detail to some extent, but I do think that it bubbles up and arguably papers over a lot of cracks. But having a feature flag system where we can tell marketing that something is going to take twice as long as it's actually going to take to build in that buffer, but we can continue to deploy directly to production and just have everything behind a feature flag. That way we can be done and be like, yep, don't worry, marketing, it's totally going to be done when you need it done, because it's actually been done for 3 weeks already. And we don't have to think about it anymore.
That is the biggest use case of the 2 week sprint that
I see you, Chris.
That exposes the flaw of the 2 week sprint, is that large projects.
Yeah.
Large projects work great for that 6 week sprints. When you're dealing with basically you have maintenance, you have little-ish projects as far as like, oh, let's add an extra checkbox here that makes this chart do this certain thing. That's not a 6 week I hope it's not a 6 week project. I mean, it could be. And then you have we're making 5 new pages, and they're going to do all this stuff for this new, release to the world. The mayor's coming to town to, declare this the greatest app ever type of thing. It's going to be held in an old high school gym with the news media. I'm speaking metaphorically, but
and before March.
Yes.
Yeah, right. Shoot, Chris.
The feature flag thing is a good point. Like the way we did this, at least, is like we were still deploying the same as if we were in Kanban. Like it was like shit was going out the door as fast as we could get it out the door. Just tried to make sure it was behind a feature flag as much as possible, or like deploy it in as safe a way as possible. So we were still doing, like, from an engineer's day-to-day work, like it wasn't all that different. Like it was still like you get a bunch of tickets. One of the differences was, and we did this a little before, like engineers wrote their own tickets. We didn't have enough product people. So we didn't have tickets generated for us. It was more, we got a mock-up, we picked apart the mock-up, we wrote our own tickets, and we went and we did them. And trying to engineer the system so that you could deploy it safely along the way, so that, to Miles's point, like ideally you're done before you get the 6-week mark. That rarely, if ever, happened. But like marketing doesn't actually release the thing and like announce it until the 8 weeks. So every other month there's a release and there's a product cycle and everything else. And it gives the business that sort of regular cadence certainty, which really did a lot of good to like repair the relationship between the business and engineering in our case. Made it go a lot more smoothly, because you mentioned like pressure going for this. Like this was triggered by a VP of engineering getting fired. And I was like, oh shit, what we're doing right now isn't working. So that's kind of where we landed onto this process, and it smooths stuff out really a lot better, it felt like.
Yeah, and the other thing is too is like it's funny you say that, because that's actually like what we're currently working on at PackSafe, is like how can we ship faster within a cycle or even within a 2-week sprint. But something, this is kind of an aside, but I guess thinking about what you're working on too, because I was trying to come up with like, I just feel like we keep saying like, oh, well, Shape Up could be agile or something like that. And to me, I'm trying to be like, okay, so what is the difference here? And I think one of the things I came up with was it comes down to like whether you're building a larger piece or you're trying to build like what they say in Shape Up is, instead of, I think what you're supposed to lean more towards is not build the front end first or the back end first. Maybe it makes more sense when you have two separate teams, but it's more about building a whole vertical slice of a cake, right? So building a whole feature, something you go from at the beginning of the sprint, you have nothing, and at the end of the 6-week sprint or the longer time period than just 2 weeks, something that you couldn't fathomably build a feature in 2 weeks that accomplishes that. That's like kind of the difference. And with agile or doing sprint planning or however, right, there's nothing stopping you from saying, okay, I'm going to have 12 tickets. All of them are 3 story points, and they're just going to be just mishmash bug fixing here, there, and everywhere. And they're all different stories relating to different things. Versus with Shape Up, it forces you to start thinking about a product mindset. Like, what is this feature accomplishing? How are we pushing this across the line? And I think that also can set you up for success for product feature-based marketing and stuff like that too. Because you start thinking more about like, what am I trying to do for the user here, as opposed to trying to fix bugs or tackling all of these small little nitpicky things that have been in our backlog for months ago and nobody remembers, right? Like you're not focusing on a bigger picture. So
yeah, one of the things I joked about was most of my job was making press releases true. We didn't quite get around to the whole like write the press release before you start the work. But
that hurts. That hurts hearing.
It's not so bad, Tony. You get used to it.
I know. I don't live through it.
Yeah.
The press release is just direct communication to the client.
Yeah. But because really that's a lot that was driving it, was again that sort of certainty of like, we can start building the marketing materials ahead of time, we can start figuring out client communication and everything else. And it also helped inform scope cuts, because it's like, okay, this is what you're going to announce. That's not this. It's not this button. We probably don't need this button right now. So it made that go a little bit better. And then unfortunately Josh would get stuck supporting whatever it is we shipped. Sorry, buddy.
So at this point,
go ahead.
At this point in the discussion. I'm really happy that like the different facets of ShapeUp that's been brought up, and like the hill charts, for example, is one of the things I'm intrigued by as a means of tracking velocity. But maybe we can kind of transition off into a conclusion for the talk, and something that I think is, we as a company are like finishing up our first cycle and kind of prepping for the real first betting to happen. And so I think, like we've been saying, ShapeUp is more than just a 6-week sprint. And so just to conclude, I'd like to hear some of like feedback on how to successfully implement ShapeUp at the company or on your team, because what's really appealing to me about it is how individually, or how it's not really that structured, and just each person decides how they're going to get something done in a company like Basecamp that has been very successful, full remote. And I think there's a lot of pitfalls to just introducing ShapeUp as it is, because as far as I understand, it's really just Jason and DHH are the ones deciding what the company's going to do, and they're only doing that, and they throw it down to their engineering people and they do the 6 weeks, and it's a lot easier said than done from that angle. So I'm nervous that at my company, we're not really going to adapt this strategy properly. And then we're going to have this like massive 6-week sprint with all the failures we currently have. So if anyone has
There's
advice.
a section in the back of the book that talks about like transitioning into using ShapeUp. And what worked for PackSafe, I mean, actually, it's not like what worked, it's just what we went through is like, I guess what you guys need to know is your first couple cycles, they're not going to feel right. Maybe you won't have the right amount of work or what have you. And the real core reason to that is like, you're supposed to be shaping like 2 cycles ahead of what you're currently working on. So like basically there should be a 1 cycle buffer, which means when we start work on cycle 5, cycle 6 should already be shaped, and the product team should be focused on forming the pitches for cycle 7, right? But when you start ShapeUp, I guess you could take the perspective of just starting with shaping maybe. But it really comes down to like, do you guys know what is the right amount of work? What is the right amount? What's the right feeling for cutting the scope? Like, how does that mesh with your engineering team? How does that mesh with what you guys generally ship in a 6-week period? How does that mesh with how you guys break apart work? Like, there's a lot of variables at play, but just know that like that stuff improves. I think one thing that's really important is to have those retrospectives, and also just like communicate as a group and try to find consensus around on your team. Like, what is something that if we were to spend 6 weeks on, we can come out of it and it's kick ass, right? And like, it's not just important. I don't think it's the right idea to say it's only 2 people that decide what to work on. It's the 2 people, it's the 2 people that ultimately like give the approval or the veto maybe, and maybe that's what you mean by decide on them. But the point being, it's like so there's that point. Know your pitches are going to suck for a little bit until you guys figure out how your product is going to form the right amount of material, and you communicate that to your developers in a way that's efficient. Like one of the things we did is we would try to shove everything for the next cycle in the cooldown period, right immediately following that 6-week cycle. So after the 6-week cycle, you're supposed to have a 2-week cooldown period, which is another awesome perk I love. But aside, we would shove it all in there. And so we would be just overwhelmed. And so trying to work through like, what is the right cadence of bringing in your engineers and spreading that knowledge. And then the other thing they have you focus on is fix your shipping problem. So going into building this brand new front end, we were literally missing 2-week deadlines every single time by 1 or 2 days because there was way too much work to do, and it just was squished down into that amount of time. Versus when you're working at a bit larger pace, you kind of the time ends up allotting the 6-week period, unfortunately, but it's you're not like pressured. You can consistently say at the end of the 6 weeks, we got this accomplished. It may not be the perfect thing. It may have a lot of scope cut that we didn't expect up front, but it was necessary to get it in the 6-week amount of time. But you start to, once you consistently ship, that's the important thing. And that's a huge advantage over if you're doing Agile and you're missing every 2.5 weeks, or it takes you 2.5 weeks for a 2-week sprint. And then that is shifting every 2 weeks what you're working on. How in the heck is the business supposed to communicate like, yeah, we're going to get all these things done in Q4 versus having these larger time blocks chunked out, and being able to consistently say, we're going to have these 3 features probably ready by this time next year. So it's that, but focus on fixing shipping first and know your pitches are going to suck. There's a TLDR of that one. So.
Yeah, to Kyle's point, the first couple of cycles you do this are gonna hurt, because you're gonna try and put too damn much in it, and you're not gonna get done, and it's gonna feel like this is awful. It's the same thing. It took us 6 weeks to fail instead of 2 weeks, and it's gonna hurt all around. The other point that Kyle mentioned is like ideally you have product thinking a cycle or two ahead. When engineering gets to it, and the first couple of times you do this, they're not going to be. It takes a while for them to build up that head of steam and get out ahead of things. I don't know that we ever really got to that point. You just get better over time at being humble enough to fit less in the 6 weeks. Like, don't think of it as 3 2-week cycles and just take the same amount of work and bucket it in there. It doesn't work that way. And yeah, eventually it's just like building a muscle. It gets a little bit easier and a little bit easier and a little bit easier. And then it just sort of becomes standard state flow. It works pretty good until you get bought by a bigger company and then you have to move all of them to do the same damn thing. That's extra fun.
So,
well, yeah, that's really good to hear. Thanks.
I feel like I probably should have read the shape up before I got to this meetup, but since I didn't, I guess I'm looking for a little bit of an overview of kind of like the parts that people consider like the one. I mean, I've heard a couple things. One is, there's this bidding session and there's this 6-week increment, but I don't know a lot more about it than that. One of the things that I'm hearing though is like the 6-week piece. It almost feels like since you know that there's going to be a lot of unknowns, you leave a lot more breathing room in your 6 weeks as to what you put into your 6 weeks, which to me seems like, I'm not advocating against 6 weeks, but I'm just saying, like, I think if people did that same process for the 2-week piece, I think they'd have the same kind of achievement. So like what I've seen in the past are two things I can think of right away. One is that there's always this need by business to say, we need to get all this stuff done for something. And so here's a big chunk you got to get done, and here it is. And you can say, well, we can't really fit all that in. And it's like, well, yes, you better, because you got to get this all done. And it just doesn't, it's not really agile. And I think if people actually listened to what the devs had to say and said, oh, yeah, we really can't do that in this 2 weeks, but I can give you this smaller chunk, and I can do this really well for you, and you'll get a good result at the end, then I think there'd be a lot more happiness all the way around if people got used to that pattern and weren't in this pattern of burning out their developers, trying to like cram everything in 2 weeks and then shifting to another 2 weeks and cramming a bunch of stuff in where it's just burnout to the point where you're like, I'm done. And I think the 6 weeks, what I'm kind of hearing is that it's kind of helping that process, and that you're kind of building in, whether it's intentional or not, it almost feels like there's this built-in spacer time to figure things out and talk through things. So one of the questions I have is, in this 6 week piece, are there times when a product owner is, or a product manager is being able to see like either how far things are coming along, or, like when are their check-in points within that 6 weeks, or is it just at the end of the 6 weeks, like here it is? I don't know. I'm curious how that works.
No, ship early and often, man.
Well, there is actually
throw that in there before I forget, which is there was this part about the marketing I was hearing about. Like the marketing wants to do the release, and this is what we have, the grandstand kind of thing. And what I was hearing is you're giving them that, but you're also saying, I'm still going to do basically my 3 2-week sprints to get my stuff done. I'm just not going to tell them about it until the 8th week, so that it really is done and we can all feel like we're successful, because I promised this to them that point and they weren't expecting it till that point, and I can kind of see how things are developing along the way. And the other part I think I struggle with, this is the part I struggle with, which is business at a stakeholder level, hearing that the Agile team is going to be producing X, Y, and Z. And they hear that on the paper right up front. Like, I'm going to give you this migration, I'm going to give you this new feature, and I'm going to give you something else. But at the end of the process, the devs actually probably deliver on all 3 of those, but they're probably a third of what the stakeholders expected that to look like. And so I think the hard part is, how do you get a stakeholder to understand, like, I'm giving you what you asked for, but it may look a lot less than what you thought it was going to look like. And you should still be excited about that, because it's still quality product that's not going to break on you. And it's doing what you asked it to do.
Yeah, that's why they're involved in the earlier conversation. Like they're in the room at the time and are part of the planning process, so that everybody agrees 6 weeks from now, this is what you can release to market.
Yeah, I guess my point there is that they're in the room. I guess that's a hard part for me, because sometimes it's hard just to even get the product owner in the room sometimes, because they're so pulled apart by other things. And I think that that's a root cause of a lot of problems right there.
So
and then
I can give you some insight.
Maybe we can just throw maybe 5 more minutes on the clock here. This is all really awesome talk. So you might have to do a round 2 at some point, but just to set a deadline. 8:35.
Yeah, Scott, real quickly to give you some insight to like how, so we have we have management, right? That wants to get a feature across the line. They want to know, when is stuff getting done, right? And so,
are we talking about Michael? Just to be clear, we're talking about Michael right now.
Used to be Michael, but not anymore. But anyway, so this is somebody that is actually coming from the Agile world, right? And so they've never seen Shape Up before, and they've got management coming down the breath, or VP of sales coming and saying, "Hey, when is this thing going to get done?" Right? So I guess, Scott, to clarify your question, you're saying, like, how do you kind of measure that progress? What do you look for during the 6 weeks?
Well, I just know if there was something within the structure that allowed that to happen.
Yeah. So what that is so it's this concept of a hill chart, right? And so you have to take, first of all, before anything's happening, you try to remove as many unknowns and rabbit holes as possible. Okay. So when you start development, it is as nailed down as possible without getting into like super UI specifics, right? But the scope is nailed down.
You want to accomplish all the risk management right up front.
Yep. So that is cut. Okay. So then once that starts, then engineers get to say, how is this work going to happen? We have the big picture on a sheet. We've identified all possible rabbit holes and places where scope creep could happen, and we know that we can deliver this product in this fixed amount of time. Then what you do is the engineers get together and they break the chunks of work down into what are called scopes. And those scopes are essentially, you can think of them as, they can span multiple tickets, but it's a grouping of those tickets for maybe a sub feature of the feature you're building. And then those scopes, you can add and remove tickets to them all you want. Okay. And they can change, they can split, they can get combined. But it's those scopes that you then plot on a chart, and I'll find it here, and it's called a hill chart. And so Basecamp has, let me show you, really can share.
That's interesting. It's almost sounding like you're demonstrating to business not just the task list, but really the epic list. And in my mind, scope is an epic. So it's, they see the bigger picture of what you're trying to accomplish is what's being presented, not all the little detail.
Yep, exactly. And the other thing is too, I think that there's a difference, and I think the book talks about this, between known unknowns and unknown unknowns, which means like there's just the nature of your work is basically what you're charting here is you say, is future applying edits, do we know what's going on, or are we to the point where we know exactly what we need to do and we're in the midst of the work building it out, or are we like, it's pretty much done and like we have some things to clean up? And so this is what the business looks at. The x-axis here is supposed to describe the amount of time. So at the midpoint of the cycle, so approximately 3 weeks, you should have hopefully most of your points past the known line. And actually, so our company was looking at like, how do you describe this? Like, because in stand-up, like, what am I supposed to do? Say like, oh, these two scopes are 3/4 of the way past the midpoint. Like, and so what we found is there's this app that I use. It's a really small app called Hylia, and it's directly tied in with Basecamp. And what it allows us to do is to come in and describe. So you can see here, unfortunately, this app didn't have scope separations. You'll see a scope as well as a ticket or like a task within said scope repeated. But imagine that these are multiple chunks of work, chunk 1 for data storing and chunk 2 for data storing, right? So you can, add things and check them off. Essentially, every single one of these corresponds to our ticket in Clubhouse, which is our ticketing system when we're Kanban focused. But anyway, and then what we show at the end of every week is we show scopes on a hill, and then we'll come in and we'll say, okay, this is mostly making it happen, and we'll give a visual representation along with a demo of like, where does the team feel that this is at? Like, and that way, if we're over halfway through a 6-week period and you have the majority of your points in the figuring things out thing, that's red alarm bells going off, right? And that gets you to prepare or say, okay, we're probably going to hit the 6-week limit and we're going to hit our circuit breaker. So maybe we're going to just attack something different and focus on a different feature, or start to, collect what went wrong. But this is kind of what I found is how you describe that throughout the 6-week period. So it's not just, all right, come back in 6 weeks, see you later. And management kind of gets an understanding of is stuff going to happen or not.
So if everything, this will be short, Adam. If everything's floating to the top of the hill, but it hasn't really gone over the hill at that halfway point, is that a judgment call on the product owner to say, let's just cut it at 3 weeks and start a new
Nope.
system?
You commit. So you commit at the beginning of your time period. You never pull out of that. And so it may be, you may just have your peak shifted a little bit. So like this peak here, it's not always going to be a perfect hill. Unfortunately, if your pitches aren't scoped properly, this line can drift to the right. And if your stuff is really easy, this line can drift to the left, and you want it to drift to the left. But it's you never want to just give up 3 weeks in. But it is an alarm bell that it's not necessarily the developers are the issue. It's, hey, maybe this pitch wasn't scoped right, and like there's something wrong here.
Never.
And that's when you'd want to start having those conversations about, hey, what is a must-have at the end of this period if it looks like we're going to land short?
Yeah, you'll probably need to. It's an alarm that you need to adjust scope. Let's put it that way. You won't just drop everything and say screw it, but yeah, you'll definitely need to make some adjustments in what is getting delivered.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Kyle. You've been kind of our residential expert on the details here. That's awesome.
I felt like I was AFK for the first half, so I'm glad I was able to chime in.
Scott, are you a member of the Indie Hackers Slack group?
Indie Hackers?
Yeah.
No, I am
You said
not.
you're from Cincinnati?
I am. I just hopped on to the Ruby Indianapolis, and I actually did that on the new location you're doing that at also today. I just happened to see it today and happened to be a good day to find it.
Awesome. Yeah, I think please join the Slack, even friendly to all parts of
Yeah, for sure.
the world. and then we can take a lot of this discussion offline or online there.
Sure.
Afterwards.
Slack location, where is that? Is that posted somewhere?
I just threw a link to the invite in the Zoom chat.
Okay, great. I see.
And it's like a Indianapolis based, but we got a lot of Midwest and beyond members there, and it's several channels. There's a Ruby channel, of course, that's one of the most active. So,
nice.
Yeah, it's been awesome. So, I want to conclude formally the ship it and software building discussion. I was blown away with all of the great involvement. So I want to hand it back over to Miles now, and thank you all for participating.
Man, I thought you were just concluding. I didn't know that it was going to be thrown back my direction. I've just been sitting here downing a bottle of wine, so this is problematic. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. I think we could probably just chat about Agile methodologies or let's see, product and project management methodologies, perhaps. And I still feel like I'm missing an aspect of kind of what we've covered tonight. But we could talk about that for hours, I'm sure. But we got to stop at some point. So feel free, as Adam alluded to jump into Indy.rb or really any of the very, like, even general on the Indie Hacker Slack and carry on the conversation. I look forward to hearing more about Shape Up and how that is going for folks. I really am hesitating because I want to ask various people questions who spoke a little bit, but maybe I feel like there's more information there that we could hear from different people. So it was really good. Really appreciate it. Yeah, and that concludes Indy.rb for the 6th month of March in 2020. Thank you all for making time in whatever this mess of a year is. I have stuck in my head, for the record, I think it was Aaron Stanton who shared a tweet or something along those lines that people keep saying, hey, do you have plans for the fall? And I keep having to stop myself from asking them if they mean autumn or the fall of civilization. Who knows which one these days? Could be either. We don't know.
Breathe, Miles. Going to be okay.
No. Glad to see you all. This is a good turnout. Glad that this segment of the world seems to be healthy and enjoying work. So everybody have a good night.
You as well. Good to see you all.